What's up guys, it's Double Zug. So if you've been playing or following MoP at all, a lot of us have been waiting with bated breath to see when/if we get some class tuning updates. So with this most recent PTR build on a random Thursday at noon, we did get these development notes here, and so I'm going to be going through these. I haven't had the time to update the sheets. Obviously this posted an hour ago and I've just been really busy today, so I will be updating all the sheets with all this stuff tomorrow. I have the time today, so I'm just going to do a little bit of like a first impressions. I have not read these in depth. And before I get into that, first of all, whenever I make one of these videos, I get a lot of questions in the comments and on Discord about like where you find blue posts. So Wowhead usually posts important stuff like this in their news section, but bluetracker.gg is a great website. It just has all the blue posts from everything. All right, so the first part of this blue post is not super important. The one thing to mention here is just Thunderforging. So the way this works is that Thunderforge gear basically just drops pre-upgraded, so you just don't have to spend Justice or Valor on it. And presumably how this is going to work, and I do believe this was confirmed, like lightly confirmed in a tweet from Zyrene, is that for the first few weeks of the raid, you will have to upgrade with Valor points. And then later on, you will be able to upgrade with Justice points to get to that Thunderforged eye level cap of 6 eye levels higher. Tier will not be upgradable. And so the Thunderforged gear is still going to be really good in off-spec slots, but you may want to swap in some pieces that aren't from Raw Den into those Raw Den slots. That's really the only effect this has on healer gearing. The healer tier bonuses are still pretty bad, so you probably still want to be prioritizing off pieces like when possible when the itemization is good. And ultimately what Thunderforge will do now is just save you some time on those Justice points, or alternatively for the first few weeks it's going to save you Valor, which is time gated. And there are some like okay decent-ish, you know, progression options from the Valor vendors and stuff like that. And again, like if you get a Thunderforge, that means you can spend that Valor to upgrade another piece you get. So it will just, you know, be a nice little bump, but this won't be like hugely important in terms of drop. So I think the original Thunderforge was like a little bit of a good thing just because it gave you a reason to log in like 20 weeks into the raid or whatever. But I think for most players, this is an upgrade. There's some challenge mode stuff, which is just like rewards for platinum, which isn't hugely important. All right, so let's get into class stuff. First of all, Death Knight, B-Res not costing runic power is great. Blood Death Knight, just a fix here for the Raw Den encounter. This isn't like a buff or a nerf, it just makes the tank like usable on this encounter, which has an active mitigation thing. And then for Unholy, we got some gargoyle changes. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments if you do play DK, probably know more about this than me, but based on what I've talked to with some DKs like in my guild and just looking at logs and stuff like that, I don't think this is like really a nerf or a buff. I don't think this really matters too much. Kind of just like a change to the pet that makes it behave a little bit more predictably, I think, for the most part. For Druid, balance got nerfed a little bit, so back to 10% from 25%, and also the damage increase on Force of Nature lowered. This 25 to 10 nerf is pretty huge. I think you could have gone a little bit easier than this personally, but I have not looked at too many DPS logs for Boomkins on PTR, so potentially warranted. Feral, the damage increase. Feral is going to go absolutely insane with rerow, so this is totally warranted, and I think this spec is going to be just fine. Guardian, getting its damage reduced is also fine. I think this tank is a sleeper tank. It does a huge amount of damage. The main problem with Bear is just that it doesn't really bring great utility, although on certain fights with like Symbiosis and stuff like that, it can be useful. Just, you know, like Banner and the stuff that the other tanks bring can be a little bit better. For Resto, the meditations in combat mana regen from Spirit raised to 55% from 50%. So Spirit was already very good for Resto Druid, and this is just going to make it better. So I think you might, unironically, depending on how this actually works, you might even like gem Pure Spirit over gemming Mastery. And I don't think it changes your gearing at all. I just think it's a little decent little buff here. It's also, you know, instead of just 5% aura buff, which is what we got in the first changes, 5% spirit buff. Interesting to see how this works out. It's also good for the play pattern because it makes you ABC rejuve a little bit more, which feels good. So I don't think it's a huge numerical buff, but it is a playstyle buff, and also Resto Druid can use a little bit of help. It's really good in 10-man. I think if you look at balance overall on the healers, if you compare just 25-man and just 10-man, it doesn't look super great. It's still like totally every healer is playable, but if you combine both of the game modes, it's actually very balanced. Resto Druid cranks in 10-man because of their target capping. Holy Paladin is insane in 10-man, and it's pretty good in 25. Like a lot of the lower played specs are actually better in the other forms. So like the 10-man specs aren't quite as good in 25-man and vice versa. Especially like Holy Priest, right? Holy Priest is absolutely busted broken in 25-man and not great in 10. Hunter, Survival, damage nerfed. I don't think this really matters, to be honest. I don't think Hunter was really going to be good anyways. You probably could have not reverted this and it would have been fine. Mage, I'm going to expect some nerfs here. I think these are all pretty warranted. I think you've seen some fire mages going insane. I also think that the other two specs are really good too. So he's getting nerfed a little bit is probably warranted and won't, you know, it's not going to make the spec dead. Paladin, Hand of Sacrifice no longer causes a GCD. This is really interesting, kind of weird. Not something I would have expected to see on this list, but very cool. It makes the, you know, the DPS slash tankiness cost of using this on ret or protection much lower. And also for healers, you know, not having to miss a global, obviously great. Kind of an interesting buff here. Again, not something I would have expected to see on this list, but pretty cool. The utility buff, not that Paladin needed any more utility, but just kind of an interesting one. For protection, we got some reverts here. So Grand Crusader, 12% from 30%. That's a big reduction. Although, you know, Protection Paladin is going to be scaling out of control. Although not like, you know, in Prague, this will affect it a little bit because it's going to be in current tier bis. And then we got the Seal of Insight nerf from 10 to 5%. So not fully removed, but 5% less haste. So I think Prop Paladin's still fully alive and is still going to be insane. Priest. All right, so now we get to the interesting stuff here, the holy changes. I did see a screenshot of this, but I didn't read through it. There's like a whole bunch of stuff here, so I'm sure this is going to be probably the longest part of the video, probably the most interesting part. I don't assume a lot of the other healers are going to be changed as much as holy. Also, just looking down here, just skipping ahead, doing some spoilering myself, not seeing any disc changes is a little bit wild to me. So let's go through these point by point here. Production to Divine Hymn's healing raised to 50% from 35%. Divine Hymn hitting every player in the raid plus the 10% healing amplification. It just did insane healing, and it was a lot better than the other comparable cooldowns like Tranquility. So I think this is like actually not as big of a nerf as it looks. I think Divine Hymn already overheals an insane amount, and in 25-man, where Holy is the strongest, at 10% healing amplification is actually like hidden, but it's an insane amount of healing. So I don't think him, like this doesn't make him weak enough that it can't solo any damage mechanic in the game. And so that means it's not really hugely important in my view. This just means like while you're channeling him, like maybe the stuff that wasn't overhealing, like maybe the ticks that go into like the tank or any player with a big dot or something that's getting chunked hugely will just be slightly less safe. But overall, as a raid cooldown, I think it's still incredibly powerful, especially again in 25-man. So kind of, it's fine that it got nerfed, honestly, not huge. All right, so next here we got reduction to the cooldown of Chakra raised to 25 seconds off. Yo, was 20? That's wild. So Chakra, I didn't expect to see buffs on this list, honestly. So maybe they'd change some stuff down here that makes this not just a pure buff, but 5-second cooldown. So this means your Chakra, if you've ever PvP'd on Holy and you get the 5-second Chakra, that's actually crazy. So this is really interesting. Also, one of the things that's a lot of people are probably not going to think of here is your damage. 5-second cooldowns mean you can be in red Chakra way more and not miss any. Like you can have every single Divine Star amplified and every COH amplified and still just be in red Chakra, which is insane. And I also think this is really interesting because it's going to make the spec feel a lot more active. Unless we get crazy nerfs to the AoE spells on the rest of this list, for healing, the AoE spells are just like infinitely better than the single target spells, so you still will be sitting in AoE for most of your healing, again, unless crazy stuff gets changed here. All right, next here we have Divine Star changes. Interesting. So healing done by Divine Star lowered by 15%. So this is a little, this is kind of a baby nerf, honestly. We got 10% on the Chakra bonuses added, so we got like a 10% buff. So this is really a reversion of that 10% plus 5% extra. The thing with Divine Star though is that this ability is just inherently broken in the way that it scales, given that almost nothing else in the game scales the way it does. And so the number that you'd have to put here for Divine Star not to be kind of broken on fights, specifically in 25-man where the rate is stacked, would have to be like, you know, 15% is not the number. It would have to be way higher than this number. I'm not sure exactly what number would be, would make Divine Star like good but not broken, but it's way higher than 15%. So realistically, what this 15% is going to do for the most part on the fights where you play Holy is just reduce your Divine Star's overhealing a little bit. And again, kind of similar to Divine Hymn, like the people who are super low, who get clipped by your Divine Star, it's just going to make them slightly less safe, but like as a raid healing button, this ability is still just like kind of inherently broken in the way that it works. Although, you know, for fights where like the timings are correct for Halo, maybe Halo creeps up a little bit. Also, I think for 10-man, this makes Divine Star even less attractive, which is, you know, kind of interesting. Holy is not like the greatest in 10-man. However, this 5-second Chakra, actually something I didn't think about. This 5-second off chakra is, I think, way more impactful in 10-man, just because for 10-man, you actually do want to be using like single target Holy Word and maybe some spot healing. Kind of a significant buff to Holy in 10-man specifically, which is interesting, right? 10-man, not typically where Holy shines as much. Prayer of Healing, I expect to see Prayer of Healing nerfs, to be honest. So let's read these. Prayer of Healing's base cast time is lowered by 0.5 seconds for Holy Priests. That's wild. Prayer of Healing's healing increased by 15%. Okay, so this is not what I expected to see, to be honest. What I expected to see with the chakra CD reduction was buffs to the single target spells and maybe some nerfs to the AoE spells. Prayer of Healing was already better than all your other filler by a lot when it hit like, 3+. So also the 0.5 second reduction is very, very, very powerful, way more impactful than it looks. You basically want to run 0 haste on Holy Priest, and also one of the big problems with Prayer of Healing in its current form is that with that 0 haste, when you cast it on a group that like gets chunked low, you will very frequently be just like sniped by other healers healing. Not as big of a deal in 10-man, honestly, and I think this is actually way bigger buff in 10-man than it is in 25-man. So this is a massive increase to the like healing per cast time of POH, so it's burst healing, way higher. And it's also a pretty significant increase to its ability not to get sniped, which is actually very important because there's a threshold where Prayer of Healing, if its overhealing gets low enough, it's like way better than COH, and I think this might push it to be way better than COH. You might not even press COH, to be honest, with this buff. Okay, so Prayer of Mending, I'm not sure what they're going to do with Palm, so let's just read this. I don't have any predictions, honestly. No longer counts as an AoE heal for Chakra Sanctuary. Okay, so this is actually really interesting and is going to be hugely impactful to your play patterns because this is like something that could actually get you to not sit in AoE chakra all the time. And this means that your chakra CD is going to be pressured, so you won't be able to stay in red as much too. So basically what this reads to me is like you're going to be swapping AoE to get your D-star out, and then you're going to be maybe popping a COH, POH, going to single target, Palm, single target Holy Word, and then you're going to be swapping back and dumping more of your mana into like for your next Divine Star, basically, and your next POH, COH. So this is quite interesting. This just means you're going to be stance dancing a huge amount, which is kind of cool, honestly. It makes the play pattern a little bit more active. Right now, what you're doing is a lot of just sitting around waiting for like COH, Palm, and D-Star to come off CD. Renew. The amount that you'd have to buff Renew to make it worth sitting in single target chakra to refresh all your renews is like a lot. So really what we're looking for here is for this spell to be buffed enough for you to want to keep it like on the tank or maybe 2 targets so that when you swap to single target to Palm, you can refresh your renews on like 1 to 2 players. So let's look at this. Renews duration increased by 3 seconds. This is actually interesting. So duration increase, this is huge for that refresh, right? So like if this gives you enough leeway that it's really easy to refresh it on like off tank or like maybe even 3 players or something like that, actually kind of an interesting buff here. I think this is more significant than it looks. I don't think significant enough that you're going to be like using Renew as a filler spell because Prayer of Healing 15% buff, the 0.5 second, reduction, like this is a crazy filler spell. And also Prayer of Healing, like this is even more of a buff in 10-man because POH in 10-man, if damage goes out on randomly on like 3 or 4 players, those 3 or 4 players are much more likely to be in the same group in 10-man than in 25-man. So that means the spell is just like at a baseline more powerful in 10-man. Also, there's fewer healers in 10-man, so you're much less likely to get sniped. Honestly, a lot of these changes are like big buffs to Holy in 10-man and just very slight nerfs to its 25-man potency with like Divine Star. Not exactly what I was expecting, to be honest. Maybe there's something crazy in the next few lines. Okay, so finishing off here, 15 seconds from 12, pretty huge, pretty interesting. And it says it also increases the amount of direct healing from Rapid Renew. So just a tiny little boost in that direct healing. Kind of interesting. Again, I don't think this makes Renew like competitive with POH as a filler, but I do think while you're swapping around to Palm, you do keep Renew up on maybe even 3 targets, but I think probably 2 is the way you do it because you Palm, Holy Word the tank, refresh your Renew, maybe heal or GH or flash heal or binding heal or something, the second tank. Actually, one thing you could do with this is keep a permanent Renew on yourself, off tank and tank, and refresh 2 with binding heal, 1 with your Holy Word. So that could be a potential play pattern. Again, I'll have to math all this out This is going to be kind of complicated to math out, so I'll hopefully get to that tomorrow. Okay, so next we have a bug fix here. Fixed a bug where chakras were not providing their full 35% to renew in palm. I should have known about this. That's crazy. I didn't know about this. I assumed they were getting the 25% like post nerf or post buff rather. So 10% more in renew and palm. So next here, more palm stuff. Palm now counts as a single targetable chakra. Okay, so we read that. Next here we have Prayer Bending's aura landing on a target will trigger the refresh duration on renew. Whoa. It will not refresh the renew when it heals or bounces. Okay, this is very interesting. So this definitely means you can keep refreshed renew on like 3-4 targets very efficiently with your normal rotation, especially with this duration increase. This is very, very interesting, very powerful, very odd to see like holy buffs here. Like this just reads to me like a buff, to be honest, especially in 10-man. Like the play pattern implications here are very interesting and very cool. It refreshing when the aura lands and not when it heals is very important. Making it like predictable and always happen when you want it to happen. That's a really good move here from Zyrene or whoever did these changes. Definitely understands like how these spells work and interact. Like this is really good. These are good changes. I just think maybe you want to aura nerf Holy a little bit. I don't know. We'll have to see. And lastly here we have Lightwell Renew and Lightspring Renew now benefit from Chakra Serenity. Okay, this is very interesting. The problem with this is like your Lightwell heals over kind of a long period of time when you put it out on most fights where players aren't like consistently super low. So you can't like put out your Lightwell, swap to single target chakra, and then it's just gonna like shotgun all those renews out really quickly. Maybe on a fight like, you know, Empress or something like that, where players are like getting chunked super low, you could kind of do that. But I think this is just a slight buff to renew on Lightwell. Before it didn't benefit from the AoE either, so this is just like a straight up buff to Lightwell. I don't think this is a reason to like pressure you into sitting in single target all the time. Actually, one thing I just thought about now though is that this interacts really well with the legendary Lightwell click glyph, the glyph that turns your Lightwell back into a click spell. If you have that, it's 50% more. And then with single target chakra, that's 35% more. So you're getting these two gigantic multipliers to Lightwell. So if you can convince your raiders, which is a big if, right? If you can convince your raiders to actually click the Lightwell, this is actually a kind of massive buff. And the boost from single target chakra could be enough to make the break point where Lightwell becomes strong enough that it actually gets your raiders to click it. Like maybe the racers will actually be playing around this ability in the race to use Lightwell, like leverage it as an actual real cooldown. Also, honestly, another kind of buff in 10-man, because if you take that click glyph in 10-man, you can have your entire raid get the renew, and then also like half your raid get it again. Very interesting changes to Holy Priest. Pretty interested to math these out. And my overall impressions from this is that it's largely buffs. Holy is going to be much better in 10-man, honestly, and quite similarly strong in 25-man. It's just that its overall raw numbers will be slightly lower because of the Divine Star nerf. This is kind of crazy, and I think it's going to make the spec way more fun to play, more dynamic. So overall, really great changes. I just think that like maybe this is too much. Like the spec was already insane. So I think this is going to make Holy, again, played more in 10-man. A super awesome swap option in 25-man for certain fights. Also, like if you're just a mono Holy player, I think this is great news, honestly, because if you only ever play Holy in all your fights, this is more damage, more single target healing, more good filler, and all those things are great. And the Divine Star nerf, not hugely going to matter too much. Also, you know, the Divine Hymn nerf, not hugely going to matter too much. Also, just in terms of like healing philosophy, I actually really like taking power away from cooldowns and abilities like Divine Star, which is kind of a mini cooldown, and putting it more into filler. So philosophically, I think these changes are also really good. Although, you know, the Lightwell buff goes against that a little bit, but forcing people to click Lightwell, in my view, is great. You know, we want those DPS players to be in pain, searching for that Lightwell to right click. All right, so Shadow here, some reversions, not full reversions though. The buff to Shadow Word Pain was lowered to 7%, and the Shadow Form damage lowered to 7% from 10%. So honestly, you probably could have not done these and Shadow still would have been like not the best spec, honestly. But I think hybrid nerfs, decent. Hybrid specs are inherently insanely powerful because of their off-healing potential, but really most guilds don't take advantage of that off-healing potential. Just having the DPS numbers be there is good. I think a full reversion of these, like to 0, would have been definitely wrong. So like a half reversion here, totally fine. All right, Shaman here. So we did not get any changes to Restope. Kind of interesting. I would have expected to see nerfs to Stormlash Totem in this section, but we did not get that. We got Elemental's damage buff to Chain Lightning and Lightning Bolt fully reverted, and then to 5% on Lightning Bolt. Fulmination damage lowered to 0%. So these are quite significant nerfs. I think the Chain Lightning one is like the most significant, honestly, because those fights that you can Chain Lightning are insane for Elemental. So this is just going to bring it a little bit more in line with other cleave specs. Also, interestingly, I don't think this is going to prevent Shaman DPS from being giga hard stacked in the race because of how broken Stormlash Totem is, but I do think this might pressure you to run more enhancement Shamans, potentially. I haven't looked at like the sims or anything like that, but potentially we might see a more even split between Elemental and Enhance. We also might see guilds more pressured to bring 2 Restoration Shamans for the extra Stormlashes there. Warlock, I expect big nerfs here, big nerfs. Affliction is going to scale radically out of control unless they get big nerfs. Also, Demonology is a sleeper one here as well, kind of scaling way out of control with the trinkets, just how broken Vision is, and also just, you know, the gear in general, scaling them very well. So Affliction, we got, it looks like mostly full buff reverts here. So 20% taken off Corruption, 5% off Agony. The Drain Soul buff was only half. We also got half off of Drain Soul's dot triggers. We got Malefic Grasp half off as well, but not fully to 0. Very significant Affliction nerfs, although these are totally warranted. The spec will still be incredibly powerful in my view with all the gear from this raid, although potentially this makes them not as attractive for progression. Demonology, Bane of Doom lowered 50 to 25, Hellfire lowered, Immolation Aura lowered, and Soulfire lowered. All these are half reverts, not full reverts, so a little bit less significant than Affliction. Demonology is sleeper, man. Once you get all the right gear, this spec absolutely pops off on some of these fights in TOT, so I would still expect to see Demo high on the meters and taken, especially in farm. But again, Warlock might just be a little bit less attractive on progression here. So like the first few weeks, you'll probably see less of them than you would otherwise. Warrior, the 4-piece set is now activated by Recklessness instead of Skull Banner for damage dealers. So just allows you to have more control over this rather than having to use it when the raid uses their thing. That's really good, I think. Overall, again, changes to Banner means they're looking at raid cooldowns. If you're looking at raid cooldowns, please just nerf Stormlash and move that power to the DPS specs themselves. Having like 9 Shamans in a raid, not hugely super fun at the high end, to be honest. Or I'd probably just like remove, honestly, if I was Zyrene, I'd just remove Stormlash from the game and give like both DPS specs a 10% buff or something like that. And then I would just nerf all hybrid off healing by 95% and just be done with it. But I'm not Zyrene. Maybe that's a little bit cooked of a healer take. So Fury's creeping up there, getting a little bit better. Rage duration reduced to 0 from 2. Not hugely significant in my view. Protection, Shield Barrier reverted. This ability was insane. It's kind of crazy they buffed it to begin with. So I don't think this kills Protection Warrior, but I think it brings it more in line with the other tanks in terms of its tankiness. All right, so we got into the end here. We just have bug fixes, which aren't like hugely important here. Notably, there's a couple of healers missing from this list, which is kind of crazy to me. First of all, the Holy Paladin. I actually think it's fine not to change Holy Paladin. I think we aren't really going to get to the point where their mastery skills so out of control that they're better than like Disc Priest at doing absorbs. That's just never going to happen because Disc Priest is busted. But they might scale to the point where they eat a little bit of the other healers' lunch. Like especially Druid, like some of these weaker HPS healers. Paladin with like the mastery they're going to be getting in Throne of Thunder and Siege Bis is going to be pretty out of control. It's just going to be eclipsed by Discipline, so it's not going to be like Bis ever because Disc just brings better absorbs and more damage. Speaking of which, again, I'll mention the Discipline Priest did not get any changes here. This is not something I would have predicted. I think Discipline Priest, there's actually a weird thing here where I think the community perception for some reason versus the reality is the most off on Discipline Priest, where I see a lot of priests dooming Discipline Priests dooming like on Discord and stuff like that over the spec being bad. The spec is not bad. The spec is like still probably too strong and could definitely be nerfed, especially with how it's going to scale in TOT Bis and Siege of Orgrimmar Bis. Your absorbs just go out of control. You have so much passive absorb generation with really high crit and high mastery. The spec does a ton of damage. It does less damage than Mistweaver, especially on Cleave, but it's still a ton of damage. And it does absorbs better than Holy Paladin, brings similar utility, but also just brings like 40% of a DPS worth of damage. So this discipline is crazy. I would expect to see like 2 or 3 in all the BIS comps if it doesn't continue to get nerfed. And it also has the leverage of being able to swap into Holy for any fight where you need the raw HPS. So like that weakness of the spec is kind of ameliorated by the fact that it has another Holy, it has that Holy spec on the same class. Priests are just going to be incredibly dominant unless Disc gets more nerfs. And one thing I'll mention here is an idea I've been actually playing around with a little bit for Discipline that I might do another video on, going through the math. I think potentially in TOT BIS or even Siege of Orgrimmar, you might want to revert Divine Aegis to the Cataform, where instead of fully replacing all your crit with Absorb, you crit and your crit does double healing, and then you get like 30% of that as an Absorb, which will be scaled by your mastery. So just theoretically would shift some of the healing profile away from Absorb toward direct healing for Discipline, and then it would allow Paladin to be competitive in terms of Absorb generation, which I think would be good for balance. But that's just, again, I haven't done the math on that. I might make a separate video on like potential balancing stuff just as an autistic ramble. Discipline Priest not mentioned here. You will definitely see like 2 discs in the racing comp in my view. I think double disc, double shaman. Maybe you put a Mistweaver in there somewhere if you really want the damage and you can get away with it. Maybe you run a Holy Paladin or something if you really want that tank healing and the utility and you don't care as much about the damage, you just want to be safe. But I think like as a baseline, just double disc, double resto shaman is still like, you know, the go-to composition. So Holy Paladin, disc not mentioned. The last thing here to mention is that Mistweaver Monk, also not on the list. No monk specs being touched here. Kind of interesting. I think it's fine for tank and Windwalker not to get touched. But so Mistweaver has a big problem with secondary stat scaling, where like all of its secondary stats are pretty bad and they don't really scale together the way that a lot of the other healer stats do. Its best stats being crit and spirit. You get big diminishing returns from those once you stop really getting much more value from mana. Maybe Uplift Glyphs helps that a little bit, allowing us to dump a lot more mana, but I just think Mistweaver is not going to scale well going into like these really high gear levels, although it does still bring incredible damage. One change that could actually make Mistweaver a little bit better is just reducing Discipline Priest's damage to be a little bit closer to the other healers. Again, I'd nerf Stormlash Totem, which indirectly nerfs Restoration Shaman's damage. I would nerf Discipline Priest's damage. You don't even necessarily have to nerf the healing. Like you could just nerf their damage by 30% and increase Atonement by 30% so that there's parity, right? It heals the same amount, you just do less DPS. And then Mistweaver, even if it doesn't scale its HPS as much, it has the niche of bringing that DPS, which I think would make it like more competitive with the other healers, especially going to these higher gear levels, and especially where Discipline Priest is just going to be so out of control with how it scales. And I also think that just generally speaking, the healer DPS being as imbalanced as it is in this version of the game is just not healthy. So I honestly think you could nerf Discipline Priest damage and Mistweaver damage quite significantly to just bring everybody to parity there. The last thing I'll mention here for Mistweaver is that you could also just like try to fix the secondary stat scaling, make haste better, make mastery better, but that is like a way more complicated math problem than just bringing Disc's damage down a little bit, bringing Resto Shaman's damage down a little bit. Mistweaver just having that niche of like a little bit less throughput going forward. It still has great throughput right now, but I think going forward it's going to drop off a little bit, but it's still bringing that damage, and the cleave might make it a little bit more competitive. But I don't think it's unplayable by any means, and I'll just finish off here by saying for 99.9% of guilds, every healer is takeable. I said this at the beginning, I think it's still true. You can run a rainbow comp, you can run, you know, your friend who likes playing Bresto Druid, you can just bring him because he likes playing that spec and you're not going to be like embarrassed or whatever. Even some of the top guilds like Who, I know brings XXUU on Resto Druid. I don't think that's like because it's the best spec. I just think it's because he likes to play Resto Druid, and he's a great player. So if you're any like normal guild, this isn't hugely significant unless you're like really pushing for like this crazy parse times or something and you have to run 12 shamans. Like, you know, it's really not that important. And I think overall these changes are quite good just because, you know, there's a little bit of tuning here and there, and then the holy stuff makes the spec a lot more fun to play and very interesting. Just a little bit more was warranted, I think, for Mistweaver. Maybe some shaman changes, maybe some disc tuning. Although, again, if you nerf the disc more, I think the Discord would riot. You might get one of those retail situations on your hands, or like the Retribution Paladin Discord shut down to try to like bully Blizzard into buffing them. Like, I think honestly some of the discs might riot. So, you know, maybe it's for the best. But yeah, that's the video. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, any commentary on these DPS balance stuff, you know, send it in the comments. Always good. See ya.
Swobo. Zug zug.